So in this video, I will talk about some advanced features of constraint layout. If you haven't seen my first video on the basics of constraint layout, I would suggest to check that one out first. So here, first thing that I wanna show you are chains. So let me just drag a couple of buttons here. I will drag 3 buttons here. And then oftentimes we feel the need to arrange the elements either horizontally or vertically. Now in order to do that, constraint layout provides us with something called chains, so we can chain them together either horizontally or vertically. So in order to do that, select all these buttons, right click, go down to chains, and then here we have an option of creating horizontal chain or the vertical chain. I will start with horizontal. So when we create the horizontal chain, we can see that they are chained together. Now their tops are still not aligned, so in order to do that, we can select all of them. Now either we can go to align and say align top edges, or can just center the elements vertically in the layout as well. I will just do that, and now you can see that they are chained together and they are vertically in the center of the screen as well. Now there are a couple of properties that chains provide. So if you go to the chains again, now they are in horizontal chain, so you can see a couple of options for arranging those elements in the horizontal chain. By default, they are spread, so they are equally spread out, as you can see here, but you can also select spread inside, in which case they will be spread out on the opposite sides. So the middle one will be in the exact middle, and the outer ones will be spread out on the outer edges. Alternatively, you can select chains packed, in which case they will be packed together. Now oftentimes we actually want to spread them out like this, but we also want them to fill the screen width as well. Right now they are wrap content. Now in order to do that, we just select the button, we go to the width, and we select 0 dp, which in this case will be match constraint. And then we do that for all 3 of these buttons. To have them fill up the screen, and obviously you can define their margins on the sides as well to give them some margins. So yeah, this is how you define a horizontal chain and arrange the elements in the horizontal fashion. Now similarly, you can do it for vertically as well. So let me just delete these ones and drag some new buttons here. So I'll drag button here, here, and here. Again, select all of them, right click, chains, create vertical chain. Now they have been chained vertically. Now we have to align them somewhere, because the Android Studio still gives us an error. We have aligned them in a vertical fashion, but we haven't defined their horizontal position. So in this case, I will just define them to be in the center horizontally. Now here you can define the same properties that we have seen before. So let's say if we go to chains and we can change the way they have been arranged in a vertical change. So we can pack them together, and we can do all the other properties as well. Now here again, if we want to spread them out, if we want them to take all the screen, in this case we will go to height, not the width. So we can just define their height to be 0 dp. And then you can see that they have been equally spread out. Most probably you will not do that, but just to, because it looks pretty ugly, but just to show you how it's done. Now I will delete all this, and I will explain a couple of options that you can see over here. So here you can see that we have 0 dp over here. This is basically the default margin that will be applied on every view that you drag out here. So let's select 24 here. And if I drag out a button, and if I define a constraint, so let's say define the constraint for the top and the left, and you can see that it has a margin of 24 for all the constraints, and you can see it here in the constraint widget as well. Now, one thing to note is that once all the margins that are defined on the views, they come into effect once you change it. So if you have, let's say, let me change this now. Let me change this to 8 and let me drag this to a new button. And I will create a constraint for this edge. Now in this case, you can see that it has given it a margin of 8, which is what we have defined over here. But for the previous button, it's still 24. So it's only applied to the new elements that you're dragging onto the screen. So this is pretty handy, because usually you want to give some margin to the views that you are dragging on the screen. Now this is for clearing all constraints. Let's say you messed up and you're like, oh, okay, I want to remove all the constraints. So you can press this, and Render Studio will just ask you to confirm that do you want to remove all the constraints. If you press yes, then all the constraints will be deleted. Your views will still be there, and you can define new constraints. Now this button here is for inferring the constraints. So if you press this, Android Studio will try to infer the constraints and define it for you. But usually I would not suggest to use that, because Android Studio just tried. So in this case, yeah, it has tried to create some constraints, but these are usually pretty weird. So usually you do not really need to use this. And the other important thing, let me just delete these, is the another important thing that you need to know at this point is the guidelines. So usually, so far we have seen that we can create a constraint for a view with respect to the parent or with respect to other views in the layout. But in constraint layout, you can basically have an invisible guideline that can help you to create a constraint as well. So let's say if I have added this horizontal guideline and this appeared over here, you can adjust it. So if you click here, it changes as you. Right now this guideline is defined from the top. Let me just drag it a bit down. So right now this guideline is defined from the top, so 194 dp from the top. But if you click here, you can change it to the bottom. So now it's defined from the bottom, or you can click it again to change it as a percentage as well. So it's 26% from the top. So let me just define it from the bottom and drag it to the bottom. So it's, let's say 100 dp from the bottom. And then you can define constraints on this guideline. So I can basically define the bottom of this button to be on top of this guideline. So as the guideline changes, you can see that the button basically is aligned with the guideline as well. So this can be useful in some situations as well. And similarly, you can define a vertical guideline as well. So this was a horizontal guideline, and you can define a vertical guideline as well. So you can see that it has arranged here, and you can arrange it as you like. Similarly, if you click here, it changes. Now for some reason this is not changing, I don't know why. But if it doesn't change, you can always go to the code, and let me see what guideline is that. So this is guideline 4. Can go to guideline 4 and change this begin to, let's say, end. And now you can see that it's been defined from this end. So and then you can drag it here. Let's drag this here. Let's have like 50 dp margin, and then you can define this button right edge to this guideline as well. And now as these guidelines change, the button basically obeys the constraints that you have defined with the guidelines. Yeah, so this is how the guidelines work. Now I want to create this layout with you. So it's basically a simple form: first name, last name, street address, and then we have a postcode, city, and then a register button. So let's see how we can go about that. So let's start with the first line. This line seems pretty simple, so let's start with that. I will just select all and delete this. And first thing we need is the edit text. So if we go to text, and here we have a couple of different options. We can just drag plain text here, And let me drag another one. Now one thing, I can constrain this to the top edge, and this one here, and then we have to define the chain on them, so create horizontal chain, and then I can align their tops as well, because you can see that even though I have created a horizontal chain, this is not really aligned with that. So I can say that, okay, select this, align the top edges. So now both of these elements are aligned. But you can see that they're a bit out, because this element is a bit out of the screen. So we should define the proper width for it. So in order to do that, you can just define this to be 0 dp and this one width to be 0 dp as well. So now they have been equally divided on the screen. And lastly, it has set the text for it. And in order to change that, you can go down here in the common attributes. Let's remove this, and we will put a hint for first name. And similarly for this one, we will remove this text and put a hint for last name. So this is our first line. For the second line, what do we need? Let's see. So we need street address and postcode. So let's drag another one, and this one I will define the constraint for this to be below this one, and then the left constraint to be on the left edge of the screen. And then for the postcode, let's drag another one, and now let's create this to be below this one, and let's add these two in a horizontal chain. So there we have these in a horizontal chain. Now once again, let's define the width to be 0 dp and define the width for this one to be 0 dp as well, so they take equal width. But here there's a bit of a difference. Here you can see that the street address basically takes more space than the postcode, because for postcode we don't really need a lot of elements over here. And so in order to do that, in order to have unequal widths for these, we need to define the weight of the properties. So if we go here, and it's a bit difficult to search, so if you couldn't find a parameter here, you can just click here. Let's search for weight, and then it gives us that layout constraint horizontal weight. So we can define a weight over here. So let's say we want this element to take 66% and the rest of the element, this postcode, to take the rest of the screen. So 2/3 of the width will go to this element, to the street address, and 1/3 of the width will go to the postcode. So I can define 0.66 here. And right now it has actually pushed it out. Let me just define it a bit differently. Let's define it to be 1. Okay, no, let's define it to be 0.66. Now because we haven't defined a constraint on the other one, it has pushed the other one out. We can fix by going to the code, and here we can define the weight for that one. So let's see, we define width of 0.33 to this one, and then go back to the design, and now we can see that this element is over here. Now the last thing is just to change the text on it. Hint street address, and then for this one we will define the postcode. Hint so there we have our second line like this. Just need to arrange it in a similar fashion that we did for this one, but we need to define unequal weights for these two elements. Now for the last line, we need city and register button over here. So we can drag this one here. Let's drag it here, define the constraints. So it should be below this one, and the left edge should be aligned with the left edge of the screen. And then we can drag a button out here. So let's say take this button out, and then we will constrain this button to be below this one, and then we can create chain on these as well. So create horizontal chain. And now you can see that these are like this. And again, here we have to define the weight. So let's go here, let's search for the weight property again. So horizontal weight 0.66. And you can see that this hasn't changed. That's because we haven't changed the width of this element to be match parent. And in this case, it hasn't dragged this out, which is good. And here, let's search for the weight again. Define the horizontal weight to be 0.33. And this hasn't changed anything because obviously I made the same mistake again of not defining width to be 0. And there we have it. So it looks the same as the above one. The last thing that we need to change is the text on it. So we will remove the text. We will send the hint, which is city in this case. And lastly, we will change the text on this button, which is register and register. So now this is how our layout is supposed to look. And we have designed it this way. I think there's a bit of a difference. We don't have any margins over here, but we can easily define those margins. So if you go here, we can define the margin to be 8 dp for this one, and let's say 48 dp here, and then 8 dp here as well. And now it looks like the layout that we wanted to design. So that's how you design a layout in ConstraintLayout. I hope you liked the video, and I'll see you in the next video.